$250 million was the formidable figure that hung heavily in the air as the former leader of the nation took his place behind the polished lectern within a sprawling convention center located in Bloomington, Minnesota, situated just a short dozen miles away from the heart of the congressional district represented by Ilhan Omar, a proximity that was carefully chosen to serve as both a subtle political challenge and a highly anticipated gathering for his dedicated supporters, where he articulated the number with the deliberate gravity of a stone being dropped into a perfectly still body of water. This staggering sum of $250 million, he asserted, had been misappropriated from a vital social initiative that was originally and specifically designed to provide essential nourishment for vulnerable children rather than to enrich adults or administrative bureaucrats, but rather to serve the innocent kids who were entirely dependent on receiving their daily breakfast and lunch at various educational institutions and community support centers scattered throughout this northern state, representing the very children, grandchildren, and neighborhood kids of the citizens. Standing before him, he allowed a moment of profound silence to settle over the venue, during which the immense crowd of approximately 6,000 individuals, a demographic that was predominantly composed of rural and working-class citizens who had, in many cases, undertaken exhaustive journeys of 2 or 3 hours simply to be present in this cavernous room, remained completely hushed, in that highly specific manner characteristic of an audience that intuitively senses the speaker on the stage has not yet transitioned into his customary performative rhetoric, but is instead carefully preparing a substantive argument. He was meticulously organizing his thoughts. He suggested noting that the distinguished congresswoman who had been instrumental in, quote, authoring the specific legislative framework that inadvertently opened the administrative doorway to this situation. The very legislation that effectively eliminated the stringent oversight mechanisms and thereby made such a vast misallocation of resources practically feasible, had publicly stated that she harbored no regrets regarding her legislative actions. He lifted his gaze from the podium, repeating the phrase with intentional emphasis, highlighting that she claimed absolutely no regrets, even in the face of $250 million, allegedly diverted from the mouths of hungry children, a statement that provoked an eruption from the audience that was noticeably distinct from the customary partisan roaring that typically characterized these massive political rallies at their most fiercely tribal moments. This particular reaction was something altogether different, manifesting as a collective vocalization of deep-seated frustration from 6,000 constituents who had been diligently following the unfolding complexities of the 12 localized fraud scandal through their regional newspapers and mobile devices, and who had been anxiously waiting for a prominent national figure to openly articulate their shared grievances, to assign a recognizable face to the bureaucratic failure, and to explicitly name the public servant they ultimately held responsible for the systemic vulnerabilities. Regardless of the fact that the meticulous wheels of the judicial system had not yet fully aligned with the immediacy of their public outrage. However, that intense moment was merely the conclusion of a much broader narrative, necessitating a comprehensive return to the foundational beginnings of the situation. Because those initial stages are absolutely critical for a complete understanding representing the nuanced context that mainstream media platforms frequently struggle to convey with adequate depth. The comprehensive Minnesota administrative fraud controversy had been systematically accumulating momentum over a period of several years, documented extensively within complex court filings, detailed federal indictments, and a continuous progression of guilty pleas that significantly accelerated throughout the entirety of the year 2024. and seamlessly carried over into 2025, ultimately resulting in a situation where by the time the prominent political figure ascended the stage in Bloomington during the cold month of January in 2026, the comprehensive judicial inquiry had already officially produced 78 formal indictments and 57 confirmed convictions, alongside an estimated total financial loss to the federal government that prosecuting attorneys suggested could theoretically approach an astronomical $9 billion when accounting for the totality of vulnerabilities across multiple interwoven social safety net programs. The undisputed focal point of this massive administrative controversy was an organization known as Feeding Our Future, a nonprofit entity that had allegedly capitalized on the unprecedented circumstances surrounding the federal child nutrition program during the height of the global health crisis, to systematically submit fraudulent reimbursement claims for an astonishing 125 million individual meals that investigators later determined were never actually prepared or served to the community. These purported meals were entirely conceptual fabrications. Just as the names of the children meticulously recorded on the submitted attendance rosters were complete administrative fictions accompanied by forged invoices and fabricated documentation that facilitated the seamless flow of $250 million in taxpayer funds directly into the hands of the individuals orchestrating the sophisticated scheme, who then allegedly redirected those resources to the acquisition of luxurious $2 million residential properties, extravagant monthly retail expenditures approaching $9,000 at high-end department stores, premium luxury vehicles, and extensive international travel accommodations. Furthermore, according to detailed reports provided by the Treasury Department, which had proactively initiated its own parallel financial investigation, there were substantial allegations regarding complex overseas monetary transfers directed toward the Horn of Africa, raising profound national security concerns regarding the ultimate destination of these funds and their potential intersection with regional instability. Representative Ilhan Omar's direct association with this sweeping administrative scandal did not stem from any personal allegation of financial misappropriation, as no credible investigative authority ever suggested she directly participated in the theft of the funds. Rather, her connection was fundamentally structural and legislative in nature. During the highly turbulent year of 2020, at the absolute apex of the pandemic's societal disruption, the Congresswoman had proactively introduced the Meals Act, a piece of emergency legislation specifically intended to temporarily eliminate certain bureaucratic oversight barriers from federally subsidized meal distribution programs, in order to facilitate a significantly faster and more agile distribution of nutritional resources during the widespread and unprecedented closures of educational facilities. The underlying intention of this legislative effort was widely recognized as deeply compassionate and well-intentioned, driven by a genuine desire to ensure uninterrupted nutritional access for vulnerable children who could no longer rely on the structured environment of school cafeterias. However, the subsequent removal of those critical oversight mechanisms inadvertently created the precise administrative vulnerability that the Feeding Our Future organization ruthlessly exploited for unprecedented financial gain. Furthermore, the interpersonal and professional connections existing between the Congresswoman's broader political network and the various individuals who were eventually implicated in exploiting the systemic gaps were numerous and extensively documented by investigative journalists, including the fact that she had previously hosted her momentous 2018 congressional victory celebration at a prominent local venue, whose co-owner was later formally convicted in March of 2025 for his active participation in the fraudulent distribution network. Additional complexities arose from the fact that she had previously been featured in promotional materials advocating for the core mission of the organization, while a prominent member of her own district staff had publicly championed the program's expansion, and a former campaign official had actively entered a guilty plea regarding the operation of a completely fabricated food distribution site, culminating in the sensitive reality that a significant majority of the 78 indicted individuals were prominent members of the local immigrant community, the very same demographic, constituency that the Congresswoman passionately represented, fiercely championed, and significantly relied upon for her enduring political support. When directly questioned by members of the press regarding whether she harbored any regrets about introducing the emergency legislation in light of the subsequent massive prosecutions, she had firmly responded in the negative, asserting, "Absolutely not," while emphasizing her enduring belief that the initiative had genuinely succeeded in feeding children in need. This specific, unyielding articulation was precisely the rhetorical opening her political adversaries had been patiently anticipating, not necessarily because the core assertion was entirely false, as the emergency legislation had indeed successfully facilitated nutritional support in numerous uncontested locations during the crisis, but rather because the phrases "absolutely not" and "no regrets," when placed directly adjacent to the parroting undeniable context of a $250 million systemic fraud that had severely compromised resources designated for vulnerable youth, constituted the exact type of politically potent soundbite that an opposition campaign can seamlessly loop into their strategic messaging for the remainder of a public servant's career, without requiring any supplementary commentary to amplify its damaging resonance. The unadorned phrase itself functioned as the entirety of the necessary commentary, prompting the former president to officially announce his highly anticipated Minnesota appearance a mere 3 days after the Congresswoman published a defiant statement on her social media platforms, wherein she characterized his persistent focus on her as deeply abnormal and indicative of a severe lack of substantive economic policy, accusing him of compensating for this deficiency by continually regurgitating what she described as bigoted falsehoods. She forcefully elaborated in her digital response that regardless of the harsh rhetoric directed toward her, she would remain resolutely undeterred in her dedicated service to the constituents of her district, suggesting that her political 20-port-4 opponent should have logically recognized by this point, in their ongoing dynamic, the inherent futility of initiating a public conflict with a deeply resilient woman of her specific cultural background. His chosen method of response to this digital provocation was a remarkably concise, single-sentence declaration, simply affirming his imminent travel to the state of Minnesota, eventually arriving in Bloomington on a brisk Thursday evening armed with a highly specific rhetorical tool that he did not customarily bring to his typical rally environments, precisely documented numerical data, instead of relying on the expansive, somewhat nebulous, and highly improvisational statistical generalizations that frequently characterized his signature oratorical performances, sweeping references to millions upon millions or billions upon billions that often felt emotionally resonant to his audience, regardless of their Caston 7. Strict adherence to traditional arithmetic, he arrived prepared with exact figures meticulously extracted directly from official court documents, Federal Election Commission filings, and formal congressional financial disclosure forms. These precise, irrefutable data points were carefully organized on physical index cards, resting securely in the breast pocket of his tailored jacket, meticulously prepared by a strategic staff member who clearly understood that this specific geographic and political Context required a caliber of rhetorical ammunition capable of withstanding the most rigorous and exhaustive journalistic fact-checking processes. The enthusiastic crowd had completely saturated the available capacity of the convention center by 5 in the evening for an event not scheduled to commence until 7, prominently displaying their trademark bright red headwear and proudly carrying a diverse array of handcrafted signage, some of which directly referenced the intricacies of the 1812 local fraud scandal, while others targeted the Congresswoman specifically, and several alluded to complex international dynamics in a manner that inadvertently guaranteed their prominent inclusion in the evening news broadcasts for reasons that likely deviated from the creator's original intentions. He ultimately assumed control of the stage shortly after 7, initiating his address in the familiar, highly practiced manner that had defined virtually every public appearance he had made since his initial political ascent in 2015, dedicating the opening moments to effusively praising the unprecedented beauty and sheer magnitude of the gathered audience, while simultaneously criticizing the journalistic establishment for their alleged refusal to accurately broadcast the true scale of the crowd. He seamlessly navigated through his standard introductory repertoire, touching upon familiar themes regarding the national economy, border security protocols, infrastructure development, military leadership, and television viewership ratings, maintaining this expected rhythm for approximately 11 minutes before finally pivoting his focus toward the highly anticipated subject that had primarily motivated the attendance of virtually everyone in the expansive room. As he formally invited the audience to discuss their local congressional representative, the resulting vocal affirmation from the crowd was absolutely instantaneous, prompting him to carefully contextualize her personal history by noting her arrival in the nation as a young refugee, a biographical detail he explicitly stated he wanted to highlight primarily because he anticipated the media would selectively edit that specific portion of his comprehensive remarks. He physically leaned closer to the microphone to emphasize his assertion that the nation had graciously welcomed her, portraying this act of national hospitality as a fundamental characteristic of the American ethos, specifically referencing her transition from a challenging Vista-Fort environment devoid of structured governmental or legal frameworks to a society that offered her a secure residence, formal citizenship, expansive educational opportunities, a flourishing professional career, and ultimately, a highly prestigious position within the United States Congress. He explicitly articulated his genuine respect for the profound journey inherent in the refugee experience, drawing a deliberate parallel to his own mother's immigrant background, describing her as a wonderful woman from a beautiful European nation who arrived with a profound sense of gratitude and a deep, abiding affection for her adopted country, subtly contrasting this idealized immigrant narrative with what he characterized as the Congresswoman's persistent tendency to publicly criticize the nation that had facilitated her remarkable success. The assembled audience offered a collective ripple of laughter, a sound that emerged before he had explicitly signaled for a comedic response, revealing their intuitive recognition of the rhetorical foundation he was methodically laying in preparation for a much sharper critique regarding a controversial public address she had delivered at a prominent fundraising event during the spring of 2019. He somberly recounted the context of her remarks, carefully noting that she was discussing the tragic events of September the 11th, a date he characterized with deep solemnity as the most devastating attack on sovereign soil in the nation's history, resulting in the Panatipr tragic loss of nearly 3,000 innocent lives, including heroic first responders who bravely ascended compromised structures, while civilians evacuated alongside dedicated law enforcement personnel, emergency medical technicians, and countless ordinary 12 citizens who embarked upon their daily professional routines never to return to their families. He deliberately paused his delivery, allowing the profound gravity of the historical reference to completely alter the energetic atmosphere of the massive room, as the thousands of attendees collectively sensed that the oratorical trajectory was definitively shifting away from light-hearted political satire and moving toward a space of intense moral consequence. He solemnly reminded the silent crowd that the Congresswoman had controversially described that day of immense tragedy by stating that certain individuals had engaged in a particular action, a phrasing he allowed to resonate in the quiet space before reiterating her exact words, emphasizing that she had utilized this specific, minimized terminology while addressing a civil rights organization that she inaccurately claimed was founded in the direct aftermath of the tragedy. He forcefully contrasted her chosen phrasing with the profound magnitude of the historical event, passionately listing the lost lives, the specific rescue, companies the heroic actions of the passengers on the diverted flight, and the catastrophic damage to the monumental structures, framing her words not merely as a clumsy misstatement, but rather as the troubling reflection of a process undie, fundamentally incompatible ideological worldview. The emotional tenor of the audience transformed completely. They were no longer engaging in the customary performative communal outrage that such political rallies are specifically designed to generate, channel, and safely release, but were instead experiencing a visceral, deeply personal anger, rooted in their own painful memories of the national tragedy and their profound revulsion at what they perceived as the trivialization of that enduring trauma. He meticulously transitioned to the subsequent index card, methodically building his comprehensive political indictment by asserting that this was not an isolated incident of miscommunication, but rather a discernible pattern of deeply problematic behavior transitioning seamlessly into a detailed recounting of a separate controversy from early 2019, wherein she had utilized a phrase referencing financial currency in a manner that was widely condemned, as invoking deeply entrenched, harmful historical tropes. Regarding geopolitical influence, he specifically noted the bipartisan nature of the resulting condemnation, emphasizing that it was the leadership of her own political coalition who had found it necessary to forcefully intervene and demand a formal retraction, a retraction he characterized as fleeting and ultimately insincere. Given her subsequent digital communications years later, that controversially grouped the actions of the nation and its close international allies in the same rhetorical space as designated extremist organizations. He expressed profound disbelief that a sitting elected official could draw linguistic parallels between a democratic republic that safeguards civil liberties, authoritarian regimes known for extreme human rights abuses, pointing out that this specific action once again compelled her own legislative colleagues to draft a public letter of censure, highlighting the extraordinary nature of a political party feeling compelled to publicly discipline one of its own highly visible members for rhetoric deemed fundamentally unacceptable. He continued his systematic review of her controversies, referencing more recent events on university campuses, previous legislative efforts to formally remove her from sensitive committee assignments, utilizing the sheer accumulation of these disparate incidents as a rhetorical weapon designed to overwhelm any potential defense of her public record. Sensing the audience's complete immersion in the narrative he was constructing, he set down the completed card and retrieved the next. A physical action that the crowd immediately recognized as a transition to an entirely new category of allegations, prompting a shift in the collective vocalization toward a sharper, more focused anticipation. He delved deeply into the highly complex and intensely scrutinized history of her personal relationships and marital statuses, presenting a convoluted timeline involving multiple religious and legal partnerships, specifically focusing on a highly publicized theory, extensively investigated by various independent journalists, utilizing public records and digital archives, suggesting complex familial ties within one of her legal marriages that was allegedly designed to bypass traditional immigration protocols. He loudly challenged her ongoing refusal to simply release the definitive documentation that could theoretically resolve the persistent speculation, dismissing her defensive claims that the inquiries themselves were rooted in systemic prejudice, and instead pointing to the stark discrepancies present within her own official legal filings. He dramatically raised a single finger for emphasis while detailing the specifics of a divorce application containing sworn statements made under the strict penalty of perjury regarding timelines of separation, and a lack of interpersonal contact, forcefully contrasting those legally binding assertions with archived photographic evidence sourced directly from her own public social media accounts that seemingly depicted the individuals together during the very period she legally claimed they were estranged. He articulated the profound legal severity of the situation, explaining that these discrepancies were not mere familial misunderstandings, but potentially constituted severe legal violations, highlighting the ongoing investigations allegedly being conducted by prominent national immigration authorities, the formal subpoenas being introduced by rival legislative committees, and the concerning findings of regional campaign finance boards regarding irregular tax filings. He invoked the detailed legal analysis of a highly educated and prominent senatorial colleague who had meticulously outlined the potential criminal statutes involved, including severe federal and state penalties, alongside substantial financial fines, before then adopting an expression of profound theatrical incredulity as he asked his captivated audience to simply imagine the apocalyptic media response if he had ever engaged in a fraction of the behaviors presently being discussed. He painted a vivid hypothetical picture of the relentless multi-network journalistic crusade that would undoubtedly occur if his own personal history contained such glaring irregularities, utilizing this stark contrast to aggressively criticize what he perceived as the profound hypocrisy of her political defenders who routinely dismissed these severe administrative and legal concerns as mere manifestations of cultural intolerance. He argued passionately that immigration fraud and cultural prejudice were fundamentally distinct concepts, clearly defining the former as a serious felony while acknowledging the latter as a societal problem, feeding off the surging, deeply resonant energy of the crowd in a continuous, reciprocal loop of political validation that neither the speaker nor the audience had any desire to interrupt. Moving methodically to the next phase of his prepared material, he introduced the deeply complicated intersections between her personal relationships and her official campaign finances, detailing the timeline of a romantic partnership that allegedly coincided with massive disbursements of grassroots donor contributions to a consulting firm intimately associated with the individual in question. He emphasized the profound betrayal inherent in utilizing the small-dollar contributions of ordinary, hard-working citizens, people who passionately believed in her stated political mission to essentially fund a highly lucrative business arrangement that ultimately funneled nearly $3 million toward digital advertising and consulting services managed by her romantic partner, whom she subsequently married. He sarcastically labeled the situation as representing the most exorbitant personal relationship in the extensive history of modern American politics, referencing formal ethical oceans problem, complaints filed by rigorous watchdog organizations, and pointing specifically to required federal filings that allegedly demonstrated significant irregularities in the itemization of travel expenses. He further highlighted the astonishing, almost incomprehensible, subsequent explosion in the Beeple financial valuation of the consulting firm in question. Expressing his own professional astonishment as a lifelong participant in the high-stakes real estate industry at the sheer mathematical improbability of an entity transforming a virtually non-existent bank balance into tens of millions of dollars in total assets over such an incredibly compressed time frame, employing his signature hyperbole to underscore the deeply suspicious nature of the financial trajectory. At this precise juncture in the address, sensing that the continuous layering of scandals and allegations had brought the audience's capacity for political outrage close to its absolute limit, he intuitively recognized the urgent necessity for a profound shift in his oratorical register, consciously dropping the pitch of his voice to signal a transition away from the realm of sarcastic political theater and into a space of deadly, serious moral accounting. He explicitly instructed the crowd that the ensuing topic was entirely devoid of humor, stating flatly that the misappropriation of $250 million from vulnerable children was a tragedy that demanded absolute sobriety, prompting an immediate recalibration of the crowded room's atmosphere as the 6,000 attendees collectively prepared to receive information that felt less like standard campaign rhetoric and more like a formal reading of a grave criminal indictment. He meticulously recounted the timeline of the 2020 emergency legislation, offering a rare moment of qualified grace by acknowledging the likely positive intentions behind the original drafting of the bill before pivoting sharply to excoriate the disastrous practical consequences of removing the essential oversight requirements, describing how a specific organization recognized this systemic vulnerability and exploited it with a level of audacity that he characterized as genuinely breathtaking. He walked the audience through the intricate mechanical realities of the fraudulent operation, detailing the systematic recruitment of local businesses and community centers to function as entirely fictitious meal distribution sites that existed solely on administrative paperwork, successfully extracting massive sums of federal dollars from the regional educational department to pay for nutritional resources that were entirely phantom in nature. He reiterated the staggering scale of the deception, emphasizing that it was not merely thousands, but rather an incomprehensible 125 million individual meals that were completely fabricated alongside the heartbreaking reality that the attendance rosters utilized to justify these massive financial withdrawals were populated entirely with the invented names of non-existent children. He passionately questioned the ultimate destination of these stolen millions, answering his own rhetorical inquiry by listing the deeply offensive luxury purchases of the convicted defendants before introducing the deeply unsettling national security dimension of the ongoing investigation, citing the specific concerns of the PACHB, highest financial and law enforcement authorities in a nation regarding the potential routing of these stolen funds toward known extremist organizations operating within unstable international regions. He quoted the director of the Federal Investigative Bureau characterizing the discovered fraud as merely the visible surface of a massively complex and deeply entrenched criminal enterprise that could ultimately represent billions of dollars in lost taxpayer funds within that single state. alone immediately moving to permanently tether these horrifying statistics directly to the Congresswoman through a meticulously documented list of undeniable professional and political associations. He systematically checked off the specific connections on his fingers. The celebratory electoral gathering, hosted at a venue purchased with fraudulent funds, of her prominent appearance in promotional materials, elevating the criminal enterprise. The direct advocacy efforts of her own senior staff members on behalf of the operation and the formal guilty plea entered by a former member of her own campaign infrastructure, creating a suffocating web of proximity that made her previous claims of absolute innocence ring increasingly hollow. He brought the narrative back to her specific defiant response when confronted with the devastating consequences of the legislation she had championed, repeating her assertion of having absolutely no regrets. With a chilling calmness, looking directly out at the audience, not as a performer seeking applause, but rather as an aggrieved prosecutor, presenting a fundamentally unanswerable body of evidence to an incredibly attentive jury. He challenged the attendees to briefly set aside their deeply ingrained partisan affiliations and to simply process the information from the perspective of parents and caregivers, asking them to genuinely contemplate the agonizing reality that funds specifically designated to prevent childhood hunger during a global catastrophe were instead utilized to purchase extravagant personal real estate and potentially finance international instability. He challenged the morality of an elected official who could look at that specific outcome and articulate a lack of regret, demanding that such a sentiment be spoken directly to the face of a genuinely hungry child, or to a struggling parent who had desperately relied on the promise of those essential community resources, asking how any public the servant could justify such immense administrative negligence to the hard-working taxpayers whose collective contributions were so callously redirected toward criminal enrichment. The resulting reaction from the massive crowd was devoid of any performative cheer. It was instead characterized by a profoundly authentic, non-performative anger, rooted in the fundamental universally understood moral principle that stealing essential sustenance from vulnerable children represents a transgression that absolutely cannot be mitigated or excused by any appeal to legislative intent, complex ideological frameworks, or rigid party loyalty. Recognizing the immense power of the raw, unadulterated emotion he had successfully cultivated within the space, he demonstrated the crucial difference between a mere entertainer and a highly skilled political operator by allowing the $2 heavy, uncomfortable anger to simply sit undisturbed in the room, understanding that any attempt to inject humor or pivot to a more comfortable topic would only serve to diminish the profound impact of the moment. Then, with a calculated quietness designed to force the audience to lean in and listen closely, he retrieved the final prepared index card, introducing a closing piece of evidence meant to finalize the portrait of profound ethical compromise he had spent the evening painting. He detailed the specific financial disclosures she had formally submitted to the legislative body in 2023, noting a relatively modest reported net worth, accompanied by standard financial burdens such as educational loans, a profile she had publicly utilized to self-identify as a relatable working-class parent entirely disconnected from the realm of the extremely wealthy. He then contrasted this relatable persona with the contents of her subsequent disclosure, filed a mere 12 months later, pausing dramatically to allow the astonishing figures, an estimated valuation skyrocketing into the tens of millions, to fully register, with the audience pointing out that this seemingly impossible financial acceleration originated primarily from two specific corporate entities legally owned by her newly established husband, he leaned on his own extensively cultivated public persona as a deeply experienced titan of industry, asserting that throughout his long and complex career, analyzing intricate balance sheets and corporate structures, he had never once witnessed a business entity transition from holding pennies in, reserved to possessing millions in recognized value within a single calendar year, suggesting with dripping sarcasm that such supernatural financial acumen was entirely beyond even his own considerable capabilities. Crucially, he emphasized that it was not his own political allies, but rather the Justice Department, operating under the direct authority of his primary political rival, that had found these profound financial discrepancies sufficiently alarming to officially initiate a formal criminal inquiry before he had even assumed his current position of authority. Utilizing this bipartisan suspicion to definitively validate his overarching critique, he set the final card down on the lectern, transitioning away from the meticulously prepared script and into the deeply instinctual, highly reactive mode of communication he always utilized when he felt a crowd had reached the exact state of emotional receptivity necessary to fully internalize his ultimate overarching thematic argument. He adopted a tone of profound, almost pastoral seriousness, demanding complete attention for a sentiment he was entirely certain the mainstream journalistic establishment would intentionally omit from their subsequent broadcasts, launching into a passionate defense of the nation's historical legacy of unprecedented generosity toward global refugees and those seeking shelter from immense international hardship. He proudly proclaimed that no other sovereign entity on the planet had consistently opened its borders more widely or expended more resources attempting to assist those in desperate need. Framing the nation's initial acceptance of the DISM, young congresswoman, when she was merely a vulnerable child, residing in a distant refugee encampment, as the ultimate manifestation of this beautiful, defining national characteristic. He explicitly clarified that he was absolutely not attempting to suppress her fundamental constitutional right to engage in rigorous criticism of the government, loudly defending the sacred nature of the foundational amendment that guarantees every citizen the vital freedom to express dissent, acknowledging that he himself frequently engaged in intense criticism of various institutional structures. However, he argued passionately that there exists a clearly defined fundamental moral boundary that must not be crossed. A boundary delineated not by complex legal statutes, but by basic human decency, asserting that it is profoundly unacceptable to rhetorically align the very nation that provided vital sanctuary with brutally oppressive extremist organizations, or to publicly minimize the profound national trauma of a devastating terrorist attack. He summarized his entire sweeping indictment, linking the controversial public statements, the deeply questionable campaign finance disbursements, the catastrophic administrative negligence regarding the childhood nutrition program, and the inexplicable personal financial windfalls, concluding forcefully that such a cumulative record did not represent legitimate political dissent, but rather a profound, unforgivable betrayal of the nation that had welcomed her, the constituents who had trusted her, and the vulnerable children who had desperately relied upon her. He lowered his voice, distilling his expansive argument down to a single fundamental emotional demand, a request for a basic, recognizable expression of gratitude, clarifying that he was not demanding complete subservience or uncritical adoration, but merely the minimum level of respectful appreciation necessary to prevent a public servant from continuously insulting the foundational character of the nation or casually dismissing the theft of resources intended for its most vulnerable youth. He forcefully rejected the predictable defense that his critiques were fundamentally rooted in cultural or religious prejudice, reframing his profound frustration as a defense of basic ethical standards and fundamental human decency before taking a deliberate step back from the podium, referencing her previous assertion that his focus on her was abnormal. He agreed completely with her characterization, affirming that it was indeed profoundly abnormal, deeply unsettling, and tragically strange that a nation capable of such extraordinary historical generosity could systematically elevate a public servant who continuously demonstrated such a profound and aggressive lack of fundamental gratitude. The massive gathering formally concluded shortly before 9 in the evening, though he remained actively engaged on the floor of the convention center for an additional half-hour, enthusiastically signing merchandise, posing for countless photographs, and repeatedly delaying his highly anxious security detail. While outside the venue, a substantial counter-demonstration organized by the Congresswoman's dedicated supporters had successfully drawn an impassioned crowd of approximately 800 individuals simultaneously. From within the protective environment of the counter-demonstration, the Congresswoman initiated a live digital broadcast that rapidly attracted an astonishing audience of 400,000 concurrent viewers, utilizing the immense reach of the platform to deliver a highly controlled, fiercely defiant response that her passionate supporters instantly recognized as the very essence of her political brand. She directly characterized the entire political spectacle that had just transpired within the convention center as a blatant, unvarnished manifestation of systemic prejudice, arguing passionately that it was an explicitly targeted attack directed against a woman of her specific demographic background, driven fundamentally by a deep-seated institutional inability to tolerate her continued presence and influence within the halls of the national legislature. The digital response from her massive audience was overwhelmingly positive, completely flooding the interface with a rapid, chaotic stream of supportive iconography and passionate affirmations that moved far too quickly for individual comprehension. While her dedicated team of digital moderators aggressively scrubbed the inevitable intrusions of hostility from the feed, she utilized the moment to firmly reiterate her absolute refusal to be intimidated or silenced by such aggressive political tactics, forcefully reminding her massive audience of her undeniable status as a fully enfranchised citizen and a democratically elected representative of her specific geographic district, declaring confidently that no amount of hostile political theater conducted in a neighboring municipality would ever possess the power to alter that fundamental democratic reality. Her meticulously delivered digital monologue was undeniably powerful, intensely personal, and strategically framed, utilizing the highly effective rhetorical language she had perfected throughout her complex career, the specific, compelling language of an incredibly resilient individual who had personally survived the horrors of international conflict and the profound indignities of displacement, and who clearly understood that her very existence in the corridors of power served as a continuous, living argument against her detractors. However, what her passionate address conspicuously failed to do, a strategic omission that had become the defining characteristic of her response to virtually any intense public scrutiny, was to directly engage with the highly specific, deeply documented, substantive allegations that had been methodically laid out during the rally. She offered no clarifying explanation regarding the $250 million, the numerous federal indictments, the specific vulnerabilities introduced by the emergency legislation, the inexplicable explosion of her personal wealth, the massive financial disbursements to her current partner's consulting firm, or the lingering complex questions surrounding her marital history, entirely ignoring the meticulously gathered publicly accessible factual data that her political opponent had so unusually relied upon. This consistent strategic approach represented a fascinating political paradox, serving simultaneously as the absolute foundation of her enduring strength within her dedicated political coalition, and the fatal glaring vulnerability that continuously compromised her broader national standing. Whenever she faced aggressive public inquiry, she consistently and effectively reframed every specific allegation of administrative failure or ethical compromise as a manifestation of deeply ingrained cultural prejudice, successfully transforming complex demands for basic governmental accountability into straightforward narratives of systemic persecution and racial animus. For her deeply loyal political base, encompassing the hundreds of thousands of individuals actively engaging with her, digital broadcast, and the broader progressive national coalition that had fiercely defended her since her initial ascension to federal office. This specific rhetorical framing was undeniably and highly effective. It succeeded largely because the individual delivering the attacks possessed a thoroughly documented history of utilizing highly inflammatory and deeply offensive rhetoric when discussing immigrant populations, providing a strong foundation of credibility to her defensive assertions. And because the broader societal challenges of cultural and religious prejudice were undeniably real and continuously relevant issues. Furthermore, the framing resonated because the sheer intensity and volume of the political targeting directed toward her was undeniably disproportionate when compared directly to the significantly milder scrutiny frequently applied to her legislative colleagues, who were implicated in comparable or even more severe instances of complex financial or administrative irregularities. However, despite its immense political utility, strategic framing fundamentally fails to function as a substantive rebuttal to documented reality and the overwhelming numerical data. The massive financial losses, the dozens of formal process, the dozens of criminal indictments, the numerous convictions, the wildly fluctuating personal bank balances existed as stubborn, undeniable realities, entirely independent of the specific ideological framework utilized to present them. These facts resided permanently within the rigid confines of official court dockets, sworn financial disclosures, and detailed investigative reports. Documents that inherently possessed no capacity to care whether the individual reviewing them was a deeply prejudiced political force, opportunist, or a paragon of moral virtue. The numbers simply articulated the unvarnished reality of the situation. Consequently, the specific segment of the rally that ultimately saturated the broader digital ecosystem was not the predictable, highly controversial clip of her opponent demanding gratitude, which was primarily circulated by her own supporters as definitive proof of his inherent bigotry, but rather the stark, unadorned footage of him simply reading the devastating statistics associated with the massive administrative fraud. That completely unembellished clip rapidly accumulated an astonishing 120 million views over the subsequent days, achieving this immense viral reach not because it possessed any inherent entertainment value. It was arguably one of the driest, most somber moments of his entire oratorical career, but simply because the underlying data was entirely verifiable. The criminal convictions were a matter of public record. The essential, nutritional resources had vanished, and the vulnerable children had undeniably suffered as a direct result. The subsequent landscape of professional political analysis fractured along entirely predictable lines, though the specific contours of the division contained subtle, fascinating deviations from the customary partisan discourse that typically followed such highly polarized events. Commentators, aligned with the progressive establishment, forcefully condemned the entire spectacle as a dangerous exercise in xenophobic scapegoating, accurately pointing out that the speaker had strategically weaponized the localized fraud scandal to cast a deeply unfair shadow of suspicion over an entire incredibly diverse immigrant community rather than focusing exclusively on the specific individuals convicted of the crimes. They comprehensively documented his history of utilizing highly derogatory language when referencing these specific populations, arguing persuasively that the rally was merely one component of a much broader, highly calculated strategy designed to systematically leverage complex administrative failures to stoke resentment against vulnerable minority demographics. Conversely, the conservative media ecosystem aggressively celebrated the performance, characterizing it as arguably the most devastating, factually rigorous, and comprehensive public indictment of a sitting federal representative ever delivered from a prominent political stage, expressing genuine surprise and intense approval regarding his highly unusual decision to rely on meticulously documented statistics and verified public records, rather than his customary, highly effective, but factually loose improvisational style. However, a distinct critically important third category of nuanced analysis slowly emerged from the cacophony. Primarily published within smaller, more rigorously intellectual outlets that still courageously attempted to hold deeply competing uncomfortable truths within the very same analytical framework, observing a complex reality that neither entrenched partisan camp was entirely willing to publicly acknowledge. This perspective acknowledged that the core, substantive assertions presented during the address regarding the mechanics and scale of the massive financial fraud were in fact largely accurate and solidly grounded in verified reality, confirming that the staggering financial figures, the volume of indictments, and the resulting convictions were all explicitly sourced directly from active federal prosecutors. They confirmed that the complex web of associations linking the Congresswoman's broader political orbit to the sprawling scandal. The specific venues utilized, the promotional appearances, the actions of her senior staff, and the guilty pleas of her former campaign personnel were undeniably matters of established public record. Just as the astonishing exponential growth of her reported personal wealth was officially documented in her own mandatory legislative filings. They further validated that the formal investigations into these deeply concerning financial irregularities had genuinely been initiated by the administrative apparatus of the opposing political party, clearly demonstrating that the intense scrutiny surrounding her complex marital history and campaign finance disbursements were not baseless conspiracy theories, but rather the subjects of active, highly serious, federal inquiry. Yet this nuanced analysis also profoundly recognized that the specific details the speaker intentionally chose to omit from his comprehensive presentation were arguably just as significant and significantly more damaging than the facts he chose to highlight, noting specifically his absolute silence regarding the prominent individual who had initially founded the fraudulent organization and who had been formally convicted as the primary architect of the entire massive criminal enterprise. He entirely failed to contextualize the scandal by acknowledging the uncomfortable reality that a vast array of similar emergency relief programs across the entire nation had been systematically exploited by individuals representing virtually every conceivable demographic, geographic, and socioeconomic background, aggressively avoiding the crucial reality that the specific local immigrant community he was broadly implicating was actually the primary victim of the crime, as it was their own, vulnerable children who had been directly deprived of the stolen resources. He completely refused to draw any necessary moral or ethical distinction between the relatively small network of criminals who had ruthlessly exploited the day, systemic vulnerabilities, and the tens of thousands of hardworking, law-abiding members of that specific demographic who resided in the state, individuals who consistently paid their taxes, diligently raised their families, and had absolutely no connection to any form of systemic administrative malfeasance. These glaring rhetorical omissions were in no way accidental. They formed the essential load-bearing architecture of the highly specific political narrative he was meticulously constructing. A narrative that desperately required the simplistic framing of an inherently ungrateful immigrant population being led by an equally ungrateful political representative aggressively exploiting the benevolent generosity of the nation that had previously offered them sanctuary. The primary architect of the massive fraud simply did not align with this carefully curated, highly prejudiced narrative structure, and was therefore systematically removed from the rhetorical presentation. In the exact same manner, a highly skilled sculptor intentionally chips away the specific pieces of stone that do not directly serve the ultimate vision of the form they are attempting to create. This deliberate, highly calculated curation of reality represented the profound essential dishonesty resting comfortably at the very core of an otherwise remarkably factually sound public presentation. The underlying numbers were entirely accurate, but the overarching moral framing was deeply intentionally destructive, and it was precisely within this malicious framing that the true lasting damage of the evening was inflicted not necessarily upon the Congresswoman herself, whose broader political trajectory was already profoundly complicated by the sheer accumulated weight of continuous scandal, but rather upon the entirely innocent, deeply vulnerable community that the Speaker had callously utilized her to broadly represent. Every single member of that specific immigrant demographic residing within the state who was exposed to the rhetoric of the rally, whether they consumed it through a direct live broadcast, viewed a highly circulated digital fragment, or simply absorbed the deeply painful summary through a second-hand account provided by a concerned coworker or a sympathetic neighbor, heard something far more profound than a simple aggressive political attack directed at their elected representative. They heard a direct, highly public assault on their own continued presence within the social fabric, a fundamental questioning of their basic right to belong, forcing them to intimately confront the profoundly agonizing existential question that all marginalized communities carry with them like a heavy, unseen stone. Whether the broader society genuinely desires their presence and participation, the Speaker's ultimate demand, once completely stripped of its thin, protective rhetorical scaffolding regarding the theoretical right to engage in political criticism or his purported respect for the abstract concept of the refugee experience, was instantly and painfully legible to every single individual who understood the historical context. It was a modernized, slightly polished iteration of the deeply prejudiced demand to return to their place of origin. He had, in fact, explicitly articulated this exact sentiment years prior, utilizing his massive digital platform forcefully suggest that she and several other prominent women of color serving in the legislature should depart the country to fix the supposedly broken environments from which they originated, despite the glaring factual reality that the majority of the targeted individuals were born entirely within the borders of the nation. While she was indeed a naturalized citizen who had arrived as a youth, the overwhelming public condemnation of that previous statement as explicitly racist had culminated in a formal legislative rebuke, an action for which he had never offered even a semblance of a genuine apology, demonstrating a profound comfort with utilizing highly exclusionary rhetoric. Now, standing behind the podium in Bloomington, he did not explicitly utilize the exact phrase demanding her departure, substituting it, instead, with a seemingly more polite but equally loaded demand for basic gratitude. A rhetorical shift that successfully occupied the exact same hostile conceptual space, served the exact same exclusionary political purpose, and landed with the exact same devastating emotional impact upon the ears of the targeted demographic. The deeply resilient individuals upon whom these heavily coded words landed understood the profound, subtle difference between the literal text of the speech and its true, underlying meaning with absolute crystalline clarity. Because marginalized immigrant communities have historically been forced to become entirely fluent in the complex, veiled language of societal rejection, having spent countless generations continuously decoding such rhetoric, simply as a basic mechanism of cultural survival. Deep within the heart of the densely populated neighborhood, widely recognized as the vibrant epicenter of this specific cultural demographic, within the broader metropolitan area, a hard-working woman named Fadumo Abdi quietly absorbed both sides of the escalating political conflict through the glowing screen of her mobile device, while taking a brief, much-needed respite from her physically demanding employment at a local home health agency, where she earned a very modest hourly wage. Fadumo possessed no familial connection whatsoever to the prominent congresswoman, had never once interacted with her in any personal or professional capacity, and had only cast her ballot in her favor during the previous electoral cycles, primarily because they shared a deep foundational cultural background, and because she genuinely believed the congresswoman fundamentally understood the profound, disorienting complexities of arriving in an entirely unfamiliar nation and engaging in the arduous process of constructing a stable life completely from scratch, while simultaneously attempting to provide essential financial support to vulnerable relatives remaining in precarious international situations. However, Fadumo had long since privately determined that she would absolutely not support the congresswoman in any future electoral contests, a deeply personal decision that was in no way influenced by the aggressive rhetoric emanating from the former president, as she possessed absolutely zero interest in consuming his political rallies, completely ignored the broader conservative media apparatus, and cared very little about the specific ideological opinions held by opposing political factions regarding her representative, her vibrant community, or her distant country of origin. Her profound, unyielding political disillusionment was rooted entirely and exclusively in the devastating localized reality of the massive administrative fraud, because she possessed a deeply personal connection to the tragedy. Her own young niece attended an educational facility that was officially scheduled to receive vital daily nourishment through a designated site, operated by the deeply corrupt Feeding Our Future network. Simply never materialized, and the specific individual formally responsible for managing that failed distribution site, a man Fadumo personally recognized from their shared community spaces, a man she had previously implicitly trusted as a respected figure, was prominently featured among the dozens of individuals formally indicted by the federal government. The massive sums of money that had been specifically allocated by the government to ensure that her vulnerable niece, alongside countless other completely innocent children in the immediate neighborhood, received adequate daily nutrition, had instead been callously diverted to finance the purchase of an extravagant suburban residence that Fadumo could never possibly hope to afford in several lifetimes of intense labor alongside monthly retail expenditures that dwarfed her own necessary living expenses. Fadumo possessed a deep, unfortunately intimate understanding of the devastating mechanics of systemic corruption. Having personally witnessed the agonizing reality of essential humanitarian supplies being quietly siphoned away by two unscrupulous individuals, while indifferent authorities intentionally ignored the suffering. During her incredibly difficult years residing within a sprawling, highly precarious international refugee encampment before finally securing her passage to the United States, she had embarked upon that incredibly arduous journey to a new nation, specifically and deliberately, to completely escape a deeply unjust environment where individuals possessing structural power could act with absolute impunity, continuously stealing essential resources from those who possessed absolutely no power to defend themselves. Now, the profoundly devastating reality was that the individuals possessing power and influence within her own tightly knit adopted community, the very people she had implicitly trusted to protect their collective interests, the individuals she regularly encountered during communal gatherings, the families whose children played alongside her own, had directly participated in the systemic theft of resources meant for the most vulnerable, while the prominent political representative she had supported explicitly declared on national television that she harbored absolutely no regrets regarding the systemic failures that enabled the tragedy. Yet, despite her profound, entirely justified anger regarding the situation, Fadumo would never, under any conceivable circumstance, find herself standing in solidarity among the enthusiastic crowds attending one of those massive, deeply polarized political rallies, nor would she ever adorn herself in their highly recognizable partisan merchandise. She fundamentally refused to offer her political support or personal validation to a deeply polarizing figure who had previously, and very publicly, characterized her entire community, utilizing highly degrading terminology, who had aggressively demanded that her elected representative return to a fractured nation, and who was currently actively weaponizing a completely genuine, deeply documented instance of localized corruption, a tragedy that had directly and painfully impacted her own extended family as a highly effective rhetorical bludgeon, not simply against the specific individuals responsible for the crimes, but against every single hard-working member of her cultural demographic who had ever attempted to build a life within the state. She clearly understood that being factually accurate regarding the specific mechanics of the financial corruption absolutely did not excuse or mitigate the profound moral failure of being completely wrong regarding the fundamental humanity of an entire population. Recognizing that while the devastating facts surrounding the Congresswoman's political trajectory largely spoke for themselves, the sweeping prejudiced generalizations applied to the broader community were deeply intentionally false. The overwhelming majority of the tens of thousands of individuals sharing her cultural background within the state were fully enfranchised citizens who worked incredibly demanding jobs, diligently paid their required taxes fiercely, protected their families, and had never once engaged in any form of systemic theft or administrative manipulation. Furthermore, this silent, hard-working majority was arguably even more profoundly disgusted and deeply traumatized by the massive ethical failure within their ranks than any genuinely outraged attendee at a distant political rally could ever possibly comprehend. And they would have readily and passionately articulated that deep frustration if the broader political and media establishment had ever bothered to genuinely solicit their complex perspectives rather than simply relying on highly polarized political figures to aggressively narrate their experiences for them. Fadumo knew with absolute certainty that the administrative fraud was not distant political abstraction, but a devastatingly real event, precisely because it had systematically stripped essential resources directly from her own immediate neighborhood, perpetrated by individuals she occasionally encountered. During deeply important religious services, she had meticulously followed the agonizing, highly detailed coverage of the subsequent federal trials through specialized native language media channels, experiencing a deeply complex, incredibly painful mixture of profound personal shame and white-hot righteous fury that lacked any perfectly precise equivalent within the English language. The specific cultural terminology utilized within her community to adequately describe this incredibly heavy, deeply burdensome emotional state carried a profound weight that the simple concept of embarrassment completely failed. Capture. It was the intense, visceral shame of profound communal exposure, the deeply agonizing reality of having the absolute worst, most ethically compromised individuals within your specific demographic, aggressively elevated and permanently held up as the definitive representative examples of your culture by an inherently skeptical broader society that had never once taken the necessary time to meet, understand, or appreciate your absolute best. Yet, despite the immense weight of this complex cultural trauma, the fundamental, undeniable facts surrounding the core issue remained absolutely rigid. The systemic fraud was undeniably real. The massive sums of taxpayer money had completely vanished into the ether, and the deeply vulnerable children had undeniably gone to sleep hungry. These cold, hard, deeply uncomfortable facts absolutely did not fundamentally alter their nature, simply because the political figure aggressively highlighting them happened to possess a deeply documented history of utilizing highly prejudiced rhetoric. Nor did the severity of the crimes somehow soften or lessen in impact, simply because the broader societal disease of cultural intolerance was a genuine, ongoing reality. Furthermore, the fundamental truth of the massive administrative failure did not magically evaporate simply because the primary architect of the entire sophisticated criminal enterprise happened to be an individual who did not fit the politically useful narrative regarding immigrant criminality, and whom the highly polarized media environment therefore often preferred to quietly ignore. The facts remained stubbornly, agonizingly consistent, and the primary fact that mattered most to Fadumo was that individuals she had previously trusted to protect their shared community, individuals who spoke her native language, intimately shared her complex historical trauma, and participated in her profound cultural traditions, had SSAT actively participated in the brazen theft of $250 million dollars specifically designated to prevent childhood malnutrition. When she heard the prominent congresswoman publicly declare that she felt absolutely no regrets regarding the situation, Fadumo felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of regret entirely on her behalf, profoundly regretting her own initial willingness to trust the sophisticated logistical promises of the local food distribution site that ultimately completely failed to deliver the necessary resources. She deeply regretted allowing herself to implicitly believe the reassuring, highly polished narratives presented by the prominent community leaders, who continuously insisted that the expansive emergency programs were operating precisely as intended. And she felt a profound, aching regret every single time she considered the agonizing reality that her innocent niece had experienced genuine physical hunger, while an individual she casually recognized from communal gatherings utilized the stolen funds to secure an extravagant residence. She possessed more than enough complex, deeply painful regrets to fully encompass both her own entirely understandable administrative naivete and the prominent Congresswoman's completely unacceptable lack of professional accountability. Acutely recognizing that the precarious rhetorical space existing between a supposedly polite demand for basic gratitude and a deeply hostile demand to return to a fractured nation was incredibly narrow. It was merely a question of adjusting a few specific words, slightly modifying the overall oratorical tone, and fundamentally blurring the crucial necessary boundary that must always exist between forcefully addressing the undeniable professional misconduct of one specific elected official and aggressively indicting an entire incredibly diverse community for her highly publicized administrative sins. The highly skilled political operator who had confidently delivered the address, an individual who had successfully dedicated the entirety of his long, deeply controversial career to masterfully navigating that incredibly narrow, highly ambiguous rhetorical space, and who had successfully constructed an unprecedented political movement upon the unique ability to articulate sentiments that were just close enough to the truth to be dangerous, while remaining just acceptable enough to avoid complete institutional rejection, would likely never possess the capacity to truly understand why his meticulous presentation of verified facts was ultimately deeply insufficient. He would never truly comprehend why simply being factually accurate regarding the precise mechanical details of the massive financial corruption absolutely did not simultaneously make him morally correct regarding his sweeping, highly prejudiced assumptions about the broader population, nor would he ever understand the profound reality that the specific, highly intentional manner in which a difficult truth is publicly articulated is frequently just as critically important as the underlying factual accuracy of the statement itself. What made this specific, intensely localized political controversy so fundamentally distinct from virtually every other highly publicized scandal in the modern political era was the absolute total absence of any clean, emotionally satisfying narrative resolution. The complete lack of any definitive closing argument that successfully settled the intense debate, and the agonizing reality that neither polarized faction could legitimately claim a definitive moral victory. The fierce, incredibly hostile public argument continuously raging between the former president and the sitting Congresswoman was not a traditional, easily understood conflict occurring between absolute right and absolute wrong. Rather, it was a deeply exhausting, highly complex collision between two entirely different, deeply destructive manifestations of ethical failure. It was the profound wrongness of a highly visible public servant who had legislatively presided over an instance of completely catastrophic administrative fraud and essentially dismissed the devastating consequences as the responsibility of others violently colliding with the equally profound wrongness of a highly powerful political leader who intentionally weaponized that exact same tragedy to systematically dehumanize an entire vulnerable demographic that was already navigating a deeply hostile societal environment. The Congresswoman's actions were fundamentally flawed. The former president's rhetoric was deeply destructive, and the countless, completely ordinary individuals who were hopelessly caught in the terrifying crossfire between their massive political egos, the hard-working transportation workers, the dedicated medical professionals, the struggling small business owners, and the ambitious students who had quietly built their complex lives within the state, utilizing the profound, quiet determination that characterizes individuals who have already survived the absolute worst trauma imaginable, were entirely correct in their complex, deeply nuanced understanding of the situation, yet remained completely ignored by the broader conversation. Later that exact same evening, the Congresswoman once again utilized her massive digital platform to communicate directly with her deeply passionate base, attracting an astonishing audience of 500,000 simultaneous viewers as she delivered a performance that was undeniably eloquent, fiercely defiant, and to her dedicated supporters, absolutely magnificent in its profound rhetorical power. She spoke passionately and persuasively regarding the absolute necessity of institutional resilience, the profound importance of continuous political resistance, and the fundamental unalienable right of marginalized women to serve their communities within the highest levels of government, without being constantly subjected to deeply patronizing demands for performative gratitude. She eloquently addressed the undeniable, highly toxic realities of societal prejudice and cultural intolerance, accurately referencing the long, deeply problematic history of the nation, continuously demanding that its newest arrivals remain completely silent, express endless gratitude, and absolutely never dare to question the fundamental fairness of the institutional structures that govern their lives. It was an incredibly powerful, deeply genuine presentation, possessing all the necessary hallmarks of a brilliant speech delivered by an incredibly resilient individual who had personally survived circumstances far more terrifying than intense political criticism, and who clearly intended to survive this current controversy, utilizing the exact same well of profound personal strength. Yet, crucially, she once again completely failed to mention the missing $250 million. She entirely ignored the profoundly concerning reality of a corporate account, rapidly expanding from mere pennies to millions, and she absolutely refused to acknowledge the innocent children who had undeniably suffered from the massive systemic failure. Simultaneously, her prominent political rival utilized his own dedicated communication platform late in the evening to enthusiastically declare the complete triumph of his recent address, loudly celebrating the unprecedented size of the gathered crowd, and aggressively reiterating his core assertion regarding her profound lack of gratitude, while pointing to the massive financial statistics as absolute proof of his overarching narrative. Unsurprisingly, he entirely failed to mention the primary architect of the entire criminal enterprise. He completely ignored the existence of the tens of thousands of hardworking, entirely innocent members of the local community who possessed absolutely no connection to the scandal, and he completely failed to acknowledge the actual vulnerable children involved as anything other than highly convenient numerical data points, specifically utilized to strengthen his aggressive political arguments. Meanwhile, far removed from the deafening, highly polarized noise of the national political discourse deep within the heart of the community, in a modest third-floor apartment overlooking the bustling local transportation hub, Fadumo, Abdi quietly set her mobile device face down on the counter and focused entirely on the profoundly important task of preparing the evening meal for her children. She carefully utilized ingredients that she had personally purchased with the hard-earned wages she had secured through years of continuous, exhausting labor within a nation she had actively chosen to call her home. Surrounded by a vibrant community she deeply loved, residing within a massive metropolitan area that still tragically could not entirely decide whether to view her as a valuable neighbor or an inherent threat. She firmly declined to consume any further digital fragments of the ongoing political argument, feeling a bone-deep, overwhelming exhaustion from constantly finding herself trapped between highly powerful individuals who aggressively lied about the fundamental nature of her community and equally powerful individuals who continuously lied in a misguided attempt to defend it. She was entirely exhausted by the endless, suffocating tension existing between a political representative who forcefully declared she possessed no regrets regarding a massive administrative failure and a political opponent who aggressively utilized coded language to demand her departure, trapped between the undeniable reality of the massive financial corruption and the equally undeniable reality of deeply ingrained societal prejudice. Most importantly, she was profoundly exhausted by the continuous, incredibly demanding daily labor required simply to exist as a complex human being who entirely failed to fit neatly into either highly polarized, fiercely contested political narrative, and who therefore essentially existed entirely outside the boundaries of the broader societal. The conversation she knew with absolute unshakable certainty that she was a deeply committed citizen of the nation, possessing all the necessary official documentation, the extensive history of tax, contributions, and the deeply integrated children who faithfully recited the national pledge every single morning within their local educational facility. Children who were currently experiencing genuine hunger, not because of a massive systemic failure, but simply because it was the appropriate hour for their evening meal. She knew that the rice she was carefully preparing on the stove, the immediate needs of her deeply loved children, and the quiet, intimate reality of this specific evening were the only things that genuinely possessed more fundamental importance than the chaotic, deeply destructive world of national politics. These intensely personal, deeply real elements of her complex existence were the absolute only things that had ever genuinely mattered more than the endless, highly polarized arguments, because the massive abstract machinery of the political establishment possesses absolutely no capacity to understand the profound, quiet reality of a dedicated mother preparing a meal. The political sphere exclusively understands highly curated narratives, heavily manipulated statistics easily, consumable digital fragments, and the endless pursuit of electoral victories. It possesses absolutely no inherent capacity to truly comprehend the profound, quiet dignity of a woman standing over a hot stove late in the evening, ensuring her family is adequately nourished. Fadumo quietly finished preparing the evening meal. Her children ate the food she provided. The meal was deeply satisfying. And just outside her window, the massive abyss of all, deeply conflicted nation continuously carried on its endless, highly polarized argument regarding her fundamental right to exist. An argument conducted entirely by highly powerful individuals who had never once bothered to simply ask her for her opinion.